So thanks very much for taking the time to talk to us today, Ed. I want to talk about what is a extremely important year for the UK on its path to net zero, with the UK being host of COP, and with lots of attention on climate issues and the environment and climate change now appearing in the top concerns of voters. And I wanted to start by asking you how important this issue is to you and to your agenda.
Well, it's top of my agenda and always has been throughout my political life. I was an environmental activist before I joined the Liberal Democrats, and I joined the Liberal Democrats because people like Paddy Ashdown and Simon Hughes were leading the way in Parliament on the environmental agenda. And I'm very proud that the Liberal Party and the Liberal Democrats have been raising environmental issues, including climate change and nature, for decades now. And I'm really proud of our record in local and national government. And what I want us to do, and we are doing, is developing quite radical policies to take the whole agenda forward. And I think hopefully on the back of our history of championing the environment, our record of actually getting things done, I think it's the best record of any political party in climate, but also our policies for the future actions. Hopefully people will see us as the serious party on the environment.
And what does that radical agenda mean to you? And in particular, one of the key things that we pull out in our commission is to look at the fairness issue. And our view, and indeed the evidence that we look at, suggests that there won't be support for the net zero agenda fully unless it can also guarantee fairness. Is that what you have in mind when you say radical?
It's part of what I have in mind. There are other things as well, but it's really vital we have a climate justice, we have a fair transition, and whether that's tackling fuel poverty, so the poorest people, we ensure that their homes are warm, are damp free, and are cheap to heat, whether it's dealing with the jobs that we lost in the fossil fuel sector and trying to make sure there are jobs that people can go to in the green sector. A whole range of issues of climate justice which have to be got right, and I don't see this government focusing on them. I'll give you an example from my time in government. I was asked by the Conservatives to get rid of fuel poverty targets. I refused. I made them tougher. And I developed a fuel poverty strategy, which was the whole set of initiatives to improve the health and well-being of people as we made their homes warmer, cut their bills. Unfortunately, the Conservatives didn't take that forward. I think the climate justice area is an issue of real difference between the parties. Conservatives don't seem to care that much about food poverty. I think it should be really high on the list of things that we need to do.
Mm-hmm. Of course, the costs of the transition have been in the news a lot, and you've seen reports of some Conservative MPs saying, actually, we need to pause because this is going to be too costly for particular groups, and particular low-income groups. What do you think is driving those arguments, and what do you say to those people?
Well, Conservatives clearly are fighting amongst each other on climate, and it's really disturbing. We need strong political leadership, and the Conservatives are just not providing that because they are divided. I also think the people who are saying it's costly are just wrong. It's going to be far more expensive if we don't act for everybody. In the transition, of course, we need to protect the less well off and ensure that they get things like warm home discounts, people who are on lower incomes, whose homes are insulated faster. But let me give you an example of things that I did in government on offshore wind, which shows that we can get the prices down. The first contract I signed was for an offshore wind farm where the price for the energy was 3 times the market price, and I was criticised for that. But because we put in policies to bring in private sector investment, create innovation and competition, the price using the auctions I brought in went down rapidly, so that price of offshore wind tumbled to less than the market price of electricity. And actually, if you look at the markets as we are filming this, last night the price of electricity on the wholesale markets, because the price of gas has gone up, the price of fossil fuels has gone up, was £200 per megawatt hour. That is hugely high. It's going to hit consumers. But guess what? The renewable power plants that I signed the contracts for, the offshore wind, the solar, the onshore wind, those power plants are now subsidising the consumer. Because the contracts I signed said that if the wholesale price of electricity, the price in the market, went higher than the price agreed in our contract, those power plants would have to pay money back. So they didn't get an extra profit from the wholesale price being high because gas prices were high. They had to pay it back. So renewable energy has become super competitive thanks to Liberal Democrat policies. We're now the world leader in offshore wind, and those projects which were initially subsidised are now repaying. Now that is climate justice. That's getting the climate benefit from renewable power plants and structuring the deal in a way which they're now paying consumer back. And so that is what we should be arguing to these right-wing climate denying or climate delaying Tories. They're just wrong. They're just wrong. And the evidence is green is cheaper.
And it's a shift, isn't it, in the way that we think about the role of government in creating markets, shaping markets to bring down those costs.
Precisely. I mean, this is heart of what Liberal Democrat economic policy has been for years, actually, working with the state and the private sector, the investors and the innovating companies to get the best deal for everybody, the best deal to tackle climate, the best deal for people who are less well off, and the best deal for investors. And if you do that, you have a win-win situation. I was told by Conservatives in the right-wing press, the same people who are backing the Steve Bakers of this world and some of the Tories in those red wall seats who are complaining about climate action, I was told by those same people that we would never get the costs of offshore wind down. Well, we did. And now the poorest people are benefiting from that. I'm proud of that. But we've got to do an awful lot more. And the policies I have advocated for, including in my conference speech, are the next stage of radicalism we need to get to.
Mm-hmm. And one of the other aspects of fairness that we heard when we talked to people across the country through our citizen juries is that they want to be involved in decision making. What's the Lib Dem approach to that? Who should have the power to decide how local areas approach net zero? And how can we make sure that's a democratic process?
Well, Liberal Democrats are champions of local democracy, of pushing power down, of using things like citizens' assemblies and citizens' juries. We believe that people are citizens and therefore they should be empowered. We want to empower people, not least in this debate. So what will we do in concrete terms? At the moment, there are policies that are the exclusive domain of national government. I particularly actually think of things like heat. That should be pushed down. And the reason why heat is so important is for it to be localised, is most of the solutions are local. Although old heating policy involved national gas grids and so on, lots of the future green heat solutions will involve local solutions. In my own constituency, for example, we're trying to work with Thames Water and their sewage works in Kingston. So those sewage works help with the district heating network plugged into them. And so we have, excuse the language, a poo to power project or a poo to heat project. That's really recycling and really renewable. And the technology is there. So you couldn't do that in there that wasn't right next to the sewage works. So what I'm saying is heat solutions are local. And if one can give power to local government and power to local communities to be engaged in those decisions, I think we can be more radical.
Mm-hmm. And finally, on our report, one of the things we argue is that nature needs to have equal emphasis to climate, and that actually the two crises in nature and climate are twin crises. Is that something you agree with, and what's the Lib Dem approach on nature?
100%. We're actually about to launch a working group on nature. We've got huge amounts of policies on climate. We've had 2 motions just at this conference on the climate agenda, and I majored on it in my speech. But you're right, we must not forget nature. That's actually what drove me to be environmentalist in the first place. My cousin, fortunately along with us, did huge amounts of work on conservation. He set up a global tiger charity to save the tiger. And he was a big influence on me before I got active in politics. So the nature side of things is crucial. And people feel that in the local communities, their local, for everything from the local parks to local air pollution to local woods, as well as water. local streams and rivers. We need to protect and enhance that, and of course for wildlife too. So the nature issue must be far more critical. And we all know there are some nature solutions which would be brilliant for wildlife and be brilliant for flora and fauna, but that would also help us tackle climate change. Mm-hmm. And we should be investing heavily in those and making sure that those nature solutions for climate are sustainable and ecologically sensible too.
Mm-hmm. And are there trade-offs? How do you handle, debates about whether to build new infrastructure when that might affect local nature? How do you handle those tensions?
Well, there are trade-offs. I mean, I'll give you a big example that I've thought about and debated with environmentalists a lot, and that's tidal power. So some people wanted a tidal barrier across the Thames, the Severn tidal barrier. I'm against that on environmental grounds. What I'm in favour of is tidal lagoons. And if you look at the environmental impact on fish and marine life, but also on birds and other species, tidal lagoons can be used to exploit tidal power, but actually enhance nature. Mm-hmm. It's far more difficult for a tidal barrier. So that may be contentious and controversial within my party, I don't know, but I'm a tidal lagoon fan rather than a tidal barrier fan. Mm-hmm. So that's an example of how you are making choices to tackle climate change, but taking nature into account in the way you make those choices.
Mm-hmm. Great. I want to talk a bit about your experience. Of course, you were Secretary of State for Energy and Climate Change. Looking back at that time, what are you most proud of, and what do you think, actually, I wish we'd done that differently, or I wish we'd found a way to move forward on this?
Well, most proud of it was renewables and the deal in Europe that I got, which led to the Paris Treaty. Renewables was you need quadruple renewable power. We changed Britain's electricity system. And the Conservatives, having been against and trying to stop what I was doing, have had to accept it because it's been so successful, with the price of wind power in particular falling. And so we're seeing Britain's power system, Britain's electricity system transform because of Liberal Democrat policies. And that would not have happened, for sure, without the Liberal Democrats. And the Europe deal, I set up something called the Green Growth Group in the European Union. So irritated and angered by Brexit that we're not able to continue at such groups. But I set that up. I led a 2.5-year European-wide negotiation on climate change. And because we were at the table, we could lead. I was seen as the greenest minister at the European table. And basically everyone knew that I had to agree with Poland because Poland was the least green. And the Polish minister and I got to know each other because everyone knew that we had to agree, or there wasn't going to be an agreement. But in order to get the Poles to be green and accept my agenda, I created this Green Growth Group, and we managed to push lots of other European countries to be far more ambitious and accept far higher targets that no one thought we could achieve. Even the Climate Change Commissioner, Connie Hedegaard, didn't think we'd achieve this agreement, but we did. And when the European heads of state announced that agreement in October 2014, a month later, the Chinese and Americans raised their ambitions ahead of Paris. So because Liberal Democrats were in Europe, negotiating in Europe on behalf of the British people, we raised everybody's ambitions, and that meant that Paris was far more successful than people had thought it could be. So whether it's on renewables or international action, they're the thing I'm really proudest of. In terms of things that I'm less proud of, I wish we fought the Tories even harder. I mean, I fought them every day, particularly people like George Osborne and Eric Pickles. In a way, I wish they exposed them for how much they were trying to get in the way of what we were trying to do. I think a big example of that is energy efficiency. Energy efficiency is really important for tackling fuel poverty, but also, I think, the low-hanging fruit in terms of insulating people's homes and saving carbon emissions and reducing people's energy bills and creating jobs. And George Osborne tried to cut that programme. It was called ECO, the Energy Company Obligation. And I fought those parts of ECO which protected the poorest, but there were other parts of ECO which were helping people irrespective of their income level. and he reduced the subsidy there, partly because Labour were talking about high energy bills and so on, and that was the only way that there could be a deal. So it was a big fight there, but I like to feel I put the interest of the fuel poor first.
Mm-hmm. And what was driving that gap? Was that about spending? Was it about an ideological view on who should be driving the green agenda, or was it something else? And how does that translate into the Conservative Party today when you think about the gap between the Liberal Democrats and the Conservatives?
Well, George Osborne, his vision was that Britain would be the gas hub of Europe. And he used to talk to Nigel Lawson, I'm told, about Britain being the gas hub of Europe. I did not want Britain to be the gas hub of Europe. I wanted to be the renewable powerhouse of Europe, and with the offshore wind revolution, which we implemented. So I think because of us, we did change policy and it was successful. I mean, clearly there's huge more to do. I mean, we focused on the electricity side because it was in ways politically easy to do because there were fewer power stations than there are houses, fewer power stations than there are cars. But also, if you're trying to decarbonise heat or decarbonise transport with electric vehicles, you can't decarbonise them unless the electricity itself is decarbonised. So we started off by decarbonising the electricity sector because we could move faster on that, but also it was an enabler for decarbonising heat and transport. So that was where we were at the time. That was the challenge, and I like to think we did it pretty well. But the challenges to decarbonise heat and decarbonise transport are ahead of us. I mean, on heat, what was problematic was there is no obvious solution yet. There's no agreement on the solution, whether it should be hydrogen or some other non-methane, non-carbon gas, or whether it should be all electric. My view, as it happens, is that we're going to need a variety of zero carbon heat sources. And that's one of the reasons why it should be decentralised, and we should involve more people in the heat solutions in their communities. But I just think we didn't make enough progress on heat because we were so focused on power.
And thinking about these experiences, if you found yourself in a position after the next election of looking at coalition government and looking at different arrangements, what lessons would you take from that experience as Secretary of State?
Well, very good. You're almost a journalist there, asking me a hypothetical question about coalition government. My job is to not take people for granted like the Tories are doing, and not count the votes before we've shown them the Liberal Democrat offer, be it on the climate or parents or carers or businesses and so on. So let me dodge the coalition question, if I may, because I think we need to be talking about Liberal Democrats' positive policies. But whether it's in government or in opposition, Liberal Democrat MPs will be campaigning for the best climate change policies possible. And let me give you one example, which I've mentioned in my speech, which I think shows how radical I want us to be on this. We can talk about the technology, we can talk about power or heat or transport, or agriculture, international efforts, as much as we like. And we need to move further and faster, far faster than the Conservatives are moving, with a far more ambitious programme. You know, look at what Joe Biden's doing with the Green Deal, Green New Deal. We need to do that approach, which is what I've argued for. £150 billion over the next 3 years, a green sovereign wealth fund, and really big stuff in the way that the Conservatives aren't. But here's the thing: however much a government spends on it, it pales into almost insignificance compared to what the private sector could and should spend on this. And so I've spent quite a lot of time thinking about how we reform the City of London, how we reform the banking markets, the pension industry, the insurance industry, the debt markets, the whole financial sector. So we move trillions of pounds, dollars, euros, yen, renminbi from the dirty fossil fuel industry into the clean, green, renewable industries. And you can do that. We've heard, of course, from people like Mark Carney. He's talked about green finance, former Governor of the Bank of England, and it's a big issue ahead of COP. And I support a lot of the work that's going on there, but it's not radical enough. So I've set out an agenda where we say no new oil and gas coal exploration should be funded in the City of London. should be allowed to list on the London Stock Exchange. And for those oil and gas companies who are still here, who are here already, who are producing the oil and gas that we will need during the transition, we need to know that they are moving to net zero, and it needs to become part of the rules and regulations of Britain's financial sector. We need to take fossil fuel money out of the City of London. That's got to be the objective. And if we do it, not only helps the transition in the UK, but actually it helps transition across the world, because an awful lot of fossil fuel money for the world's fossil fuel industry is raised in London. Mm-hmm. So if we show leadership there, we are catalysing the decarbonising agenda, the move to green zero carbon technologies across the whole world. And if we did it in London, we could put pressure on New York, on Frankfurt, on Tokyo, the other big financial capital centres to do the same. Now that is radical. I sometimes worry that other parties you've got whose heart is the right place on climate don't want to engage with the way markets work, with the way the city works, and they're failing to engage with that. But having very sort of, I would say, very left-wing solutions, it would actually not help the climate as much. If we want to help the climate as rapidly as is needed, if we want the radical measures to make sure we are responding rapidly to the climate emergency, we need to see these trillions of dollars of private capital switch quickly. And the Liberal Democrat solution that I'm championing would do that. That is why we are the most radical policy on climate party on climate in the country today.
And do you think you do that by regulation of the city?
Yes.
Or do you do it, and is it complemented by an approach that makes it expensive to do those activities? How would you balance it?
Well, you could. There's roles for both. I'm a big fan of the emissions trading system, for example, which persuaded some of the big fuel emitters to look at less carbon, less heat-intensive processes. But I think this is an emergency. I think it requires tough rules, tough new laws, tough regulations. And I know the Conservatives don't like regulations. They don't like their friends in the cities being regulated. Well, they should be. And we should lead the way in our country. Do you know, if we did that, there would be an absolute bonanza for green jobs. I think with good policies, you could protect the poor, you could have the just climate transition, and you could really catalyse and charge rapidly the move to the net zero economy that we need. That is leadership. That's the leadership that we need. And we're just not getting it from Johnson.
Talking of Johnson, looking at his government, is there anything where you think, yes, that is the answer, you should be doing more of that? And is there anything where you think, please stop doing that, that is not the answer here? What are your kind of...
Losing to Liberal Democrats and Cheshire membership, that's really good stuff. No, seriously. The problem is they do a lot of talking. A lot of talking. The good thing is they've kept some of the policies that we implemented, particularly on offshore wind and renewables. And I'd like to see them move further and faster there, but they've kept the Liberal Democrat framework for supporting renewables. So to say that they've kept what we put in place, that's good, and I can support that. But they've been so slow in other areas, and they went backwards. You know, they got rid of our zero carbon homes. They undermined carbon capture and storage of carbon capture and usage. They're not pushing ahead with the green hydrogen agenda, which is, I think, so important. They took money out of energy efficiency. They've taken money out of solar. They've taken money out of electric vehicles. They're not pushing ahead with electric charging. I mean, I could go on. So, you know, I think Johnson is just not doing what is required. And, you know, when it comes internationally with COP, which maybe you want to talk about now, I think they're making huge errors.
I would like to talk about COP and in particular what the role of the UK should be. We've talked a bit about the EU and what Lib Democrats wanted to do through the EU. not in the EU anymore, what is the role of the UK in driving forward a global net zero agenda?
Well, I first of all talk about regulating the City of London to get fossil fuel money out of the City of London and switch huge amounts of money into green. That's good for the UK, it's good for the world. So that's still the radical global leadership we need. But we've got COP, let's talk about COP. Now, we're the host. We need to have been working far faster and for far longer to bring countries together. Now, I led the British delegation at 3 COPs in Doha, Lima and Warsaw, and I actually gate crashed Paris, even though I wasn't a minister at the time, because I've been so involved in the Paris preparations. And what you saw in those is when they had good leadership by the host country, you could bring things together. So Laurent Fabius was the president of the COP, and he was extremely experienced French politician with global standing. And he had the support of the President Hollande. I don't see that here. In fact, I see the reverse. We've got much less influence in Europe, for a start, because of Brexit. We've got much less influence in the White House, although Joe Biden is a breath of fresh air compared to Donald Trump, of course. I'm sure he wants to help, and he's got a great team. I think his relationship with Boris Johnson is not in a great place. Again, partly because of Brexit in Northern Ireland, of course. I think this government has done huge amounts to alienate the Chinese, and while I'm all in favour of course, of standing up for human rights, particularly for Uyghur Muslims and Hong Kong Chinese, I think they've failed to sort of square that circle, and that's a huge error. And worst of all, in terms of the diplomacy you need before a COP comes together, is the way they've cut development aid to the poorest in the world. And that's wrong in itself. It's beyond immoral during a pandemic. And when you're trying to persuade all these developing countries to sign up for a critical climate agenda, it is sea on stilts. It is sea on steroids. I mean, what are they thinking of? And so their failures at Brexit, with Americans, the Chinese, with the whole developing country, they're not doing very well in climate diplomacy. I spent a lot of time on climate diplomacy. Now, I went to China, I went to New York, I was around in Europe with the Green Growth Group. I went to the UN. I've never seen a host government handle it so badly. And they're letting down this country, they're letting down the whole world. So do I think Johnson is a total charlatan on climate? Yes, I do. He's failing to do leadership in this country, failing to do it globally.
What do you say to those who argue that actually it's not up to the UK to go first, that China is such a big emitter that it's pointless us going first, we can just wait till 2040 and then start thinking about it? How do you make a political argument that actually that's the wrong approach?
Well, it's totally the wrong approach. First of all, we were the first country to industrialise. There used to be king coal in the 19th century. And therefore, this country has been putting a lot of it up for centuries. So we do bear an obligation. And of course, we import a lot of the materials that China uses. So, in your report, you talk about the emissions from consumption. So I just think that people who want to just blame the Chinese and say, so therefore we should do nothing, they're absolutely, utterly wrong in their analysis, and it's morally reprehensible. And the best way to do it is for us to be world leaders, develop the technology, work with others, and to be internationalists. Liberals are internationalists to our core. That's why we're so pro-European. And why, if we were in the hot seat hosting COP, we'd have approached it in a totally different way.
So we've talked about a lot of problems today. What gives you hope for the future? What do you think actually this is really going to change things?
Well, ordinary people give me hope. I mean, you found from your citizen assemblies and juries that they're ahead of many of the politicians. And that's great. public opinion, it might change even Conservatives' minds. Fortunately, Conservatives have got so many vested interests that gets in the way, but hopefully people power will help. I think technology has been dramatic. I mean, the reduction in the cost of solar and wind has been fantastic. And I think that shows that these right-wing climate delayers are just wrong on the cost, and therefore gives me hope that we can move even faster than some people fear. Let me tell you, this is where I get a bit lyrical, you have to excuse me. Some Liberal Democrats have heard me say this before, but the reduction in the cost of solar is one of the biggest steps forward in human history, and probably is the biggest single contribution to tackling climate change, because what it means is, in many developing countries where they have a lot more solar radiation over the year than we do, I think in India they have 300 plus days of solid solar power. They can power their futures, whether it's they're looking after their food or medicines, like for the schools or their industry. They can do that in a clean way, and so that they can come out of poverty using renewable energy. And the great thing about solar is it's a devolved, distributed, decentralized energy source. You don't need big pylons like you do with fossil fuel power stations. You can have a microgrid in a village in the middle of Africa or middle of Asia, middle of Latin America. So you can bring clean power to the poorest. So you tackle climate change, you tackle poverty. And guess what the other thing you do is, and this is where some people disagree with me, I think I'm on firm ground, you can actually reduce conflict and war. How come? If you look at the people who are funding wars and conflicts, internal conflicts and conflicts between countries in our world, they're often people who've got a lot of money through oil and gas and coal. The Vladimir Putin's of this world, the rulers in Saudi Arabia, the rulers in Venezuela, the rulers in Iran. And oil and gas geopolitics has created huge problems in our world and led to horrible wars. If people can have energy independence, power independence, because they can use the sun in their country or the wind in their country or the tidal power in their country, then they're rich as a country. They don't have to spend all their hard-won earnings on buying in oil and gas, but also the pockets and coffers of the Kremlin, the pockets and coffers of the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia are depleted, and I just think that's fantastic. I think that's about the climate justice agenda internationally and the peace agenda internationally. So that's why I'm a fanatic about renewables.
People, power, peace, and climate justice. I think that's a positive note to end on. Thank you very much, Ed, for your time.
Thank you.